Randos show is produced live in Sunroom Studios' Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Good afternoon or evening. It is the 11th of June, and it's getting pretty crazy out there. There've been a lot of spikes in cases nationwide, and there's a lot of contention about the stay-at-home orders, and some people say can't go out because of COVID, but can go out because of protesting. And I think there's a fairly disingenuous false equivalency being presented there. One of them is a health concern, and the other one is a civil rights concern. And they're not separate. They're very linked to one another. But it's more complicated than that. We know that this thing is far from over. It's not under control, and we're definitely not winning. And this is the kind of thing that can still kill your parents or your friends or your friends' parents. And so it's just, be safe and be smart, because it's really not funny to find out that somebody their mom or their grandma is in the hospital. And all we can do is be safe and encourage our friends to be safe. And so with that, I'd like to welcome our guest tonight, Daniel Aylott. He's been on the show before, and we're gonna have a great show tonight. We've got a little bit in store for you. There's this theme out there running around about how we got to reopen the economy so that we can get economic mobility back in action, get the machine functioning again. And there's something to be said for that. But there's also something to be said for the downturn, and that it's demonstrating that a lot of businesses, in fact, have poor business models and aren't going to weather this storm, even with help from the government. And so recently, I came across this theory that talks about or describes the city or the urban center kind of like the phoenix rising from the ashes, and in that we will see businesses leave, and those spaces will be vacant, but the infrastructure will still exist. And this will invite new businesses and new migration into these urban centers. And this is going to bring diversity in the form of the arts, of music, culture, cuisine. And I think this is a really good thing. And I think that there's a huge benefit to this kind of diversity, this growth within diversity. And I don't want to shortchange that. We've got a really good opportunity here to build a better, brighter tomorrow.
I think that opportunity to build is something that is kind of, it can't be underemphasized in that a lot of the systems were not green, and they weren't conducive to a sustainable economic infrastructure before. So now we have the chance to get on track and not be dependent on fossil fuels and things like that. So, beyond the restructuring for the sake of not spreading germs, I think there's definitely something to having this as a chance for sustainable development.
Oh yeah. I think that's the highest goal is that we figure out a way to have sustainable development, and we're not talking about destroying the existing infrastructure. I think that's like a worst case scenario that, another thing I've noticed is that I see a lot of threads develop online where people will jump to the worst possible conclusion about something, like defund the police, which, the common complaint is it's got a bad headline, it's got a bad call to action. But that really just represents what that individual brings to the table in terms of their interpretation.
these are also a lot of cases like Bible literalists too. So it's, the worst demographic to leave language in their hands because they always go for the, most literal, lowest interpretation.
Yeah.
Knowing that it's the most literal, and they do it on purpose. It's this weird literal culture.
The lowest hanging fruit.
Yeah.
When we also talk about infrastructure, it's important to consider infrastructure isn't just roads, bridges, buildings. It's social services, it's community services, it's availability of resources to all citizens. And I think what we're seeing is a massive reevaluation on a national scale of how such an equitable redistribution is going to be achieved. And people are asking the right questions. People are looking at the allocation of resources to various services within our societies, within our cities, within the greatest congregations of human beings in a given area, so those being our cities. And they're asking, what is the worth? What are we getting out of this? What is the return that the citizens are seeing, are receiving based off of what we've been experiencing, what we've been seeing? And it's been pretty clear that some resources are being overly directed in a particular direction. And now we're looking to see how we can rebuild.
Yeah.
So we're seeing, yeah.
That's a good point. It's not obvious. The path forward isn't clear. It's not obvious. It's a bunch of choices that have yet to be made, and there's people want to wait for data to make decisions. Some people just want to go ahead and jump. I tend to favor waiting until we have more information typically, but at this point, the numbers are all rising as a result of the Memorial Day relaxation of the policies. And now we're on the verge of experiencing the COVID protest wave because we're over 2 weeks into protests, nationwide protests, global protests. Oh, it's actually quite incredible. The entire world is taking a knee in protest. I think the funniest thing I saw was in England, they tore down a statue of a slaver and then tossed it in the river. And then they said that the statue tripped and fell.
Yeah, and all these statues coming down is creating the bringing up the discussion about whether it's beneficial to tear them down or rename Air Force bases that were named after Confederate generals or Confederate heroes and shit like that. But they never should have been named that in the first place.
Yeah.
There's no reason we should glorify losers in war.
Or generals from another army.
Or imperialists. Christopher Columbus didn't found this country.
He never set foot on this country.
It had nothing to do with the United States of America. So as far as why we need to pay reverence to him, you can't discover something when there's people here, clearly. So that notion of him discovering the continent is just absurd. So we just haven't some of us have, but we just haven't updated our lexicon concerning Christopher Columbus as a he's a colonizer. He's not a discoverer. He didn't discover anything.
Here in Massachusetts, the statue of Christopher Columbus on the ocean front in the harbor was removed of its head. There's a headless statue standing out there.
Wait.
Christopher
Didn't
Columbus.
Isabella threaten to cut his head off if he didn't bring back riches from the New World and spices and all that stuff?
I suppose Isabella laid a curse and retribution centuries later.
Well, apparently, Mitch McConnell, I feel like he's actually in charge of conservative America, at least when it comes down to actual policy, because he seems to be the one who stands in the way of anything actually happening. He came out and said that the statues are a state-level decision. So, in a sense, he's saying that Congress isn't going to step in or get involved. Actually, I just thought of something. What Chris said was saying about renaming bases that were named after Confederate generals. Apparently, the base named after General Lee, the man himself who was the great leader of the Southern Army. Apparently, the base they named after him is a logistics base, and he was notoriously bad at logistics. And I feel like this is a really, that's kind of interesting. That whoever made that decision, either they didn't know that he was really not talented with logistics, or they did know, and they were making some slight jab at Army intelligence and logistics management. And I think
that's curious. It's also interesting to note that the Marines and the U.S. Navy have banned the Confederate flag being displayed in public spaces or areas that are considered shared spaces.
They can't even have bumper stickers anymore.
You can't have bumper stickers, no mugs, no flags, no stickers in your cubicle area if you're working indoors. Probably nothing in your personal bunks either. I'm not sure about that. NASCAR isn't allowing the Confederate flag at its events anymore.
No, they are. They're allowing one. It's the surrender flag. That white flag that they wave whenever they have to get people to slow down. They're still allowing that. I think that's fine. We can allow that surrender flag to exist. I saw this other observation about NASCAR, and it was how does this go? The divorce of America is really strange. The left got NASCAR, and the right got J.K. Rowling.
Yeah, crazy how that shit worked out, huh?
Oh, man.
Man, Rowling, going off on trans, that whole thing is super weird because it's on the one hand, it's if you don't understand your own identity, I can see how somebody else's identity might threaten yours. But she's old enough where she should know who she is, and there's no reason trans people should threaten her identity at all. So it's it's weird that there's because she also I don't know if anybody notices, she refuses to use the word cis, it seems like, and she calls women natal born if she wants to, instead of using the word cis or the prefix cis.
Natal born?
Yeah, I don't even know what she's doing this whole language thing where it's you can tell she doesn't want to acquiesce to. It's not even new language. It's new language to people who didn't know what cis was, in that now that we have a word or a prefix that, articulates between someone who's cisgendered and transgendered, the people who are cisgendered shouldn't have their identities threatened by transgendered people. It's just kind of absurd. So for her to go off on that rant is it's super attention seeking, where you're there's no reason. All she had to do was not say anything.
Exactly. She didn't have to say any of this.
So Google defines natal as an adjective relating to the place or time of one's birth, her natal home.
So it's redundant to say natal born.
Yeah.
It looks like J.K. Rowling is doing the thing that she did in her books by just creating names for people like what the wizards did to the humans, made a special name for them.
Well,
She's coming up with special names for people that she doesn't understand or respect. We all know where that goes.
yeah, I feel like we're going to end up with a generation of people who are as influenced by her as they were as the generation who was influenced by Ayn Rand, who read Atlas Shrugged and thought it was like the greatest form of, or a piece of work of literature ever. And whereas most people, you know, leave their teenage years and find more complex literature or more meaningful literature or deeper or more insightful literature, there's a significant group of people who seem to believe that Ayn Rand had some kind of magic wand over economics. That whole side room of individuality and
Ayn Rand's primary audience are people who have all the resources that the people who are the protagonists in her novels never had to begin with. So
That's very true. Yeah.
it's like one of the protagonists is this great industrialist fellow who came up with I think it was a new formula for some special kind of metal or steel, and he did it all by himself, and he was the genius who came up with the idea, and he turned it into this super multi-billion-dollar empire, and he didn't have any seed money, and he didn't have any of this, and he didn't have rich parents and this and that. And basically you have the story going of he pulled himself up by his own bootstraps. But the people Ayn Rand actually appeals to, the people in positions of power, the contemporary positions of power that she appeals to, had so many more chances.
What an incredible fantasy.
It's a total fantasy. It's a self-perpetuating fantasy. People can then say, oh, I'm just like this guy. I'm just like this guy. I had nothing, right? It basically invalidates all the help that I received throughout my entire life, so I can act like I'm better than everybody else. Stroke my ego.
I'm pretty sure that's the opposite of rising from the ashes. That's just building some kind of contraption out of nothing. What an incredible fantasy. That's actually more profound, I think, than the boarding school fantasy that Rowling created.
Well, and I think the crazy part about this fantasy is that a lot of these kids are just inheriting stolen wealth and looted wealth, so they have to create this narrative around it that's making it seem as if there was some honest aspect to it. And that's where that whole stock market bullshit comes in, where it's like people laundering and washing money through the stock markets for the last, 100, 200 years or whatever. And it's like, or not necessarily stocks, but in like commodities and shit. It's like that type of, it's that type of thing that leads people to come up with mythology like Illuminati, when really it's just people laundering money.
I really enjoy the reframing of the Illuminati as just a bunch of money launderers.
Well, and that's the funny part about it is, if a bunch of people do it, it looks like they're doing it together when they're all just doing it individually, because they're all little selfish, unethical fucks. But that's kind of where
you can be in the Illuminati if you have any cash-only business. So you can have an Illuminati of pizza stores.
I mean, that's what ends up happening, because, say for example, you guys remember when the tomato shortage happened?
Yes.
Then it's like, yeah, if you can make a shortage happen some way or another and make it appear organic, then you can influence your own market, and it's that easy. And I think that's where, again, it's like supply and demand is super easy to manipulate. You don't have to manipulate 50%. You only really have to manipulate like 1 to 3%, and then everybody goes running based on speculative um, like conditioning. Again, it's like if one person sees like a trend they think is about to happen, then another person sees that person going towards the trend, and it's a cascade of trend watchers when really it just takes one person to cascade it and not get caught.
I think that's a really, really solid elaboration on FOMO.
Exactly, it's definitely FOMO.
The fear
FOMO is real.
Yeah, fear of missing out is a thing. I've seen that happen, in various like retail establishments where something will become the trend. Like everyone's got to wear the where are they, the rompers, when the rompers and the onesies were all the rage last summer or whatever. I remember being at the mall and just people were just going in for those, and that was it. Those things aren't even that great. They're just jumpsuits with short legs and short arms. But people are spending a lot of money so they could have a fancy red jumpsuit with short legs and short arms. And
with
now
the least amount of material possible.
And now I don't see any marketing for that anymore. Nobody cares about those things. I wonder when singlets are going to become all the rage. No, that FOMO was actually incredible with when cryptocurrency, when everyone was going nuts about the value of Bitcoin and Ethereum and all of the cryptocurrencies. I remember everyone was talking about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, even if it wasn't actually Bitcoin that they were talking about. And that was just on the most shallow end of the pool. And it's still fairly pervasive now. People talk about Bitcoin because it's the biggest cryptocurrency that everyone's heard about. But that's not even where that wasn't even the market that had the problems where people were using it for really illicit transactions. So we're at a pretty interesting place.
Yeah, well, it's really crazy too because we're a decade in, so it's not even like that.
Honey.
Technology is new anymore. But it's funny how even in light of pandemic, people just are not switching to digital solutions in a way where I'm just amazed at the resistance of people to learn new shit. But it's like, cash is a religion, man, apparently.
Cash is a vector.
Well, yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. It's definitely a vector, but it's a vector for shit you don't want it to be. I don't want to get a disease from my cash.
Yeah, I was so worried about the mail. I built a UVC appliance with a timer to flood a small space with ionizing radiation to kill whatever's in there. And incidentally, the price of those bulbs, actually I got a 2-bulb system several months ago, and the price of a single bulb now, just the bulb, not the enclosure, not the timer, not the stand that I've used, just the single bulb costs as much as the entire appliance that I constructed. It's a real concern. I think that anyone who isn't staging their mail or any incoming packages, they're just playing Russian roulette. There's no telling how many people have handled that within the 2 to 3 days that it takes for the protein encasing to break down. Oh, Jason Luna asks, on an earlier discussion, he says, it makes one ponder how to handle proper people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson's monuments, where they were also slave owners. And I think that that's actually a really interesting point, is that even within the history of America, when it's not the Confederacy, we have we have a significant portion of our history that is comprised of slave owners.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole 65 years, almost 70 years leading up to the Civil War where those guys had slaves.
Yep.
At some point, that should be addressed as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, black people have been trying to talk about it for a long time, but it's funny. I saw something where there's this element of when you have somebody like Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. come along, for whatever reason, white people will want to act like he solved racism, and then it just resurged or something. And it's like this thing that's in the past where because people weren't seeing it in their lifetime until recently, they thought it went away and then came back when really there just weren't cameras around. So it's weird to see this element of, like, a lot of people are just now learning about the Tulsa race riots. And
Rosewood in Florida too, I believe.
And what's up?
I think there was a place in Florida called like Rosewood.
There was multiple. I mean,
yeah.
but the Tulsa one is most significant in that there was like a whole community of black-owned businesses, banks, you know, doctors, plane, fucking. They had their pilots who would do like the crop dusting and shit. So it was a self-sustained black community that when you find out all the professionals and all of the infrastructure that existed, you can't get this narrative that black people are incapable because we already had it, but the racist people just bombed it out of existence and then made it seem as if it's a conspiracy theory that actually happened. So there's people who are believe that's equally as likely to have happened as UFOs landing. So that's where, again, it's like we can't be at this point where there's Americans who think something that's 100 years old, a historical event that's 100 years old, is a conspiracy theory that got made up. Because these are the same people that, you know, the Holocaust deniers and shit.
Yeah.
Like, it's the same fucking people.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned UFOs because the Air Force and Pentagon finally admitted that UFOs have been sighted. So it looks
but that doesn't mean anything. That just means that it's unidentified.
I know, but I mean, that's the thing. It means that it's okay for these people to believe that these things happened.
It's just, I mean, again, the language reinforces the narrative because their language allows people to extrapolate it into something that it wasn't. Like, the Pentagon acknowledged that the videos that had been leaked that had unidentified flying objects were indeed leaked by the Pentagon and were in fact legitimate. That doesn't make any claims about extraterrestrials, the origin of the spacecraft. People extrapolate what they want, and the language makes none of those claims, and that's the problem where, again, it's like when people were saying like, oh, they acknowledged these videos and nobody cares, it's because their language implies that the videos don't mean anything. It's like, yeah, they got a real video and they don't know what's in it. Great. That's meaningless. That's useless information to me until you can tell me something about the video and the contents. It's just useless, and we can say it's fucking fairies. We can say it's like unicorns that we can say it's big feet that came up with technology to allow them to. We can make up all this shit.
We don't know that Bigfoot hasn't possessed this technology the entire time, though. That's the thing.
Right. Yeah, we don't know.
Maybe isn't it a perfect setup, though, to release this information with, you know? But
it wasn't released. It was old information.
Yeah.
That video is fucking old.
Yeah,
that video came out in like 2014, and then came out in 2017, and then came out again in 2019, and then came out again this year, because they go to it every time they're trying to distract people from real, legitimate, like, they come out with these bullshit worded allusions to, oh yeah, it's real, every time they're trying to distract from something legitimate.
Yeah.
And that's why I get frustrated, because it's like, yeah, guess what? I want aliens, I want extraterrestrials to be real, but that's not fucking proof. That ain't proof of shit. That ain't proof of shit.
No, it's absolutely not. And I think that's the dilemma, is that we have all of these agencies that just obfuscate it. Everything is at every turn. I remember when I think I was in high school, there's a movie called Wag the Dog. And it was all about a group of people who control the optics surrounding the office of the presidency, the administration itself. And I think Willie Nelson was on it, and it's just, we live in a world full of spin doctors, and they can't tell the truth because their job depends on controlling the optics. Because people don't want to, we're all looking at computers right now. Everyone has the potential to look all this stuff up. And even if you knew what you were looking for, there's so much crap out there that the likelihood of finding something real is very low. In fact, it almost seems like the internet serves to feed into confirmation bias more than anything. There's no curation.
Well, that's just like this is probably a couple decades, well, not a couple decades, about 15 years ago now. A professor put up a bunch of articles about a tree octopus, and because it was on the internet and because he had put up enough, he successfully created a conspiracy that the tree octopus was a real thing. And he was trying to prove a point that just because you can find information confirming what you believe to be true doesn't mean it was true. And that's always like, that's a great example, because when you look it up, it looks legitimate. And he did a fantastic job of laying a bunch of breadcrumbs to make it look like somebody actually randomly discovered a tree octopus, and then a bunch of people started writing articles about it. And then other people discovered the tree octopus. So he made it look like the growth was organic and discovery was organic, because he understood how information works. But when you have people trying to learn if something's real, the Dunning-Kruger effect and confirmation bias is like a big hurdle where people just don't know how to get over their own confirmation biases and continuously go to the same information outlets that reinforce their narratives and give them the narratives in the first place.
Yeah.
Should be a part of a curriculum for any student learning how to search for information on the internet. There should be a training module on confirmation bias.
Yeah, that'd be great. It'd be funny if Google made you take that test before it allowed you to search anything, Why leave it up to Classroom? Google's the one that's, it's crazy where there's a law that if somebody is a bartender and they've served someone who is visibly drunk past the point of impairment, that bartender can get in trouble. Giving somebody bad information without giving them education, that's dangerous. And we need to acknowledge that there's danger in that. So I think that there's some, like, if the government, I don't know if it's necessarily the government's place to do it, but maybe it is. I don't know. But Google needs to regulate itself in that it can't just have people stumbling upon information, reinforcing, all these views that their algorithms are helping to reinforce in the hands of untrained search users. That's kind of, there's a lot of shit that happened in our lifetimes that we haven't really had the chance to necessarily step back and assess about what they truly mean. Because again, it's like Google's not a publicly owned entity. It's a private company. It's a private organization. They shouldn't necessarily be held to the First Amendment standards. And that said, if we're talking about public channels of information access being a thing, there's like an argument that there needs to be some sort of government information channel that's accessible and free, but also curated to incorporate the First Amendment so that the algorithms aren't weighting things based on, whether it's pay to play or somebody at the Google organization or whatever, there should
information
be an
tax
alternative. Yeah, there's an information tax that happens whether we see it or acknowledge it or not. And that's kind of like, we believe our information is free, but when it's coming through a private organization, it's 100% not free.
So we're going to take a quick break here. And with that, I'm going to give you a little bit of House Panther. If I can find it. And we're back. Emily asks, how do you guys feel about Indiana's, and more specifically Bloomington's, opening up of businesses and public spaces? Is it too soon in your eyes? Where do you think this will land us in a few months? Well, I can tell you that I think that I don't think that these decisions are not being driven by data. unless we're qualifying, the financial data of our elected officials' resources. If their pocketbooks are hurting, then I think that's really what's driving these decisions. Because every place that's opening up early is having a spike of some sort. Every place that decided to relax their healthcare guidelines, those places are all suffering right now. Like, I think just today I read that Florida and Texas and Arizona are all experiencing the highest new case numbers that they've had this entire time. And I don't think that, and the part that really gets me about this, of course, especially with Indiana, is that Indiana was touted as having been the first state to develop solid software modeling to track and predict the rate at which this disease would be spreading and how to, and this was supposed to give them insight into how to engage in economic recovery. But the reality is that it doesn't really seem to be working. Every place is still experiencing some kind of COVID-related hotspot spike, and this is going to be exacerbated by protests. But as I said at the beginning of the show, I don't think that healthcare issues and civil rights issues can be examined with the same lens. One of them is a direct threat to everyone, and the other one is a direct threat to everyone. And it's in our best interest to resolve both of these things. And if one of them isn't addressed, then we're stuck with the same problem.
Well, what's unfortunate is that some of the tactics being used on the protesters is preventing proper social distancing from continuing to occur throughout the protests. And it's also causing protesters to take their masks off, or it's causing respiratory distress, or it's causing, it's creating conditions under which a virus can more easily spread or take root in the human body. So there's something to be said for that as well.
Yeah, I think it's like, I do understand there is the element of people are worried about the second, well, I don't even know if we can call it second, like whatever number wave this is of infections after the protest. But at the same time, I feel like there's like a hierarchy of concerns, and when like people it's like you gotta worry about COVID, but at the same time, the protests are actually a more pressing issue.
Yeah.
Because cops can end people's lives effectively with impunity at their whim. So it's kind of like, it's difficult to articulate that there is somewhat sort of a more pressing.
They're both healthcare issues.
Well, it's like they're both healthcare issues, but one is an issue of what's the word? It's like a government entity that has control over people's persons, and the other one's the issue of people having control over their own person.
Yeah.
And that's where, when you have a force that can effectively just kidnap people, and then make up a reason after, like, that's a huge fucking problem.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, dying from COVID's a huge problem, but the issue, like, once COVID goes away, we'll still have a kidnapping force.
Yeah.
And that's a huge fucking problem. And there's this notion of like, yeah, COVID may not go away if we don't address it correctly, but it's a lot easier to get rid of COVID apparently than it is to get rid of murderous police, because we've been dealing with murderous police for at least 100 years now. So that's kind of where, again, it's like, this shit, we're not going to get rid of them in 2020 either.
Yeah. With
whatever defund police movement, wherever it goes. cops are still going to be murdering people at the end of 2020, but it's going to be better because we're already on a better trajectory. But that's kind of where, again, it's like, it's very difficult for Americans to discuss both of these things at the same time, because it's like when the protests happen, Americans are like, oh, did COVID just disappear? Like, no, it didn't disappear. Our media is just not capable of discussing more than one complex issue at once. Unfortunately, that's what it boils down to.
Absolutely. If you watch some of the interviews with people who were out on Memorial Day, not wearing any PPE, crowding the beaches, flocking together, exchanging air, and the questions that were asked were, are you concerned with infecting others? Are you concerned with getting infected yourself? And people just so easily devalued their own lives, saying things like, if I get it, I get it. If I die, I die. Everybody's got to die sometime.
I wonder how many of their parents or grandparents are sick now.
Right. In Arkansas, there was an 88% increase in cases since Memorial Day.
That shit just makes me so fucking mad and sad. That's the willful ignorance that is bringing everything down. Or not
exactly.
But it's one of the expressions of the willful ignorance that's bringing us all down.
And to that point, exactly, it's the willful ignorance. It's the inability to have an attention span beyond one's personal desires in a single moment, to enjoy yourself for a moment in exchange for your own health security and the security and the secure health of your family members. I think that in some ways allows the media to justify focusing on one thing at a time. I don't think it's that they can't. I think it's that they believe it would be more profitable to just focus on one big thing at once, to get everybody focused and riled up and hooked into one idea, and then see where the next trail of blood is leading to.
Yeah, that's a good point. Emily asks also, do you guys feel like the racial tension and protests were intentionally stirred in order to get black people of color, and those that support them out in close contact in an effort to spread the disease among these folks?
No. Like, there's a couple conspiracies I've seen floating around. Like, let me be clear, our government is not that coordinated. It's just not that coordinated. And like, it'd be fantastic if they were that coordinated, because they could use that coordination for other things.
Yeah.
They're just not that coordinated. It's crazy. Like the U.S. government is amazing at taking events and retroactively looking like they were aware and had some sort of plan. But as we can see with COVID, they completely half-assed a reaction to it. And then only once they found out that black people were the majority, well, not the majority, disproportionately affected by it, then they're like, oh yeah, we can open up the economy. They are good enough to have genocide by convenience, but they're not good enough to execute genocide on a covert scale without us finding a document. Like, if there was a document somewhere where Trump was like, let's have black people, let's like get black people riled up so they go die from COVID, there would be a fucking tweet somewhere or some message, because he's not that smart. And further, more white people probably end up getting affected by it than black people at the end of the day, because they're just showing black people on TV, but in reality, there's like proportionally like a lot more white people out there. So just by numbers, there's probably a lot more white people that got exposed. It's like proportions don't work out. Like there's probably more people that end up getting sick in Appalachia after this year than black people altogether. And by the time the COVID wave spread, and that's where it's like, I've seen people like throw, because I'm not trying to pick on Emily's version. I've seen people throwing around this conspiracy today, and I'm like, yeah, it'd be great if our government was that coordinated. They're just not. They're just not that coordinated.
Well, I think a good conspiracy theory relies on a quality of optimism that yeah, exactly what you're saying. That people are that organized, or that people can keep secrets. And I may have mentioned this several shows ago. I saw this meme that was essentially saying, like, that's the kind of optimism that project managers lose really quickly, because they have difficulty wrangling in a dozen people.
Oh my God.
Maybe not even that. Like, I had a group of, I was in one of my classes during the spring. I was one of 4 people in the entire class, like 20 something people, to finish the final project. There were only 4 of us, and it was difficult to all be online at the same time. And the term before that, I was in a group with 3 people, and we agreed on a time to meet, but half the time it was me and one other person, and there was a 4th person in that group who just never appeared. We didn't know what was going on. So if it's difficult to get 3 people to agree to meet at the same time every week, and it's difficult to get 4 people, almost impossible actually, get 4 people online all at the same time. Actually, that's not true. The 3 of us are online right now. So if it's difficult to get people together online all at the same time and to be present, I mean, just you got to have a really incredible project, or people got to be paid a lot to show up. They get like 12 people all to show up at one place to work on a project and keep it quiet.
And this gets back to that whole notion of the appearance of coordination because of culture. So like, doctors around the country didn't get a memo saying turn away black people if they ask for, if they say they're hurt. But if you're black and you go to a doctor and you say you have some sort of pain, they're probably not going to give you a painkiller, because they're assuming you're just there for drugs because of the culture. So it's not like there's some racist memo. It's a racist culture.
Yeah.
So that's kind of, again, where it's like, it'd be really convenient if there was like a specific memo that somebody was like, yeah, let's do this thing and like stoke flames of racism, and let's kill like a black person every week to piss off black people. Because that's what happened. It wasn't George Floyd. It wasn't one black person. It was like damn near a black person every week. We just found out about him at different times. So like, again, the shit, like the George Floyd shit had happened right after the Sean Reed, had happened right after the Breonna Taylor, had happened right after
Ahmaud Arbery.
Ahmaud Arbery. There's too many killings. This shit wasn't court. Like, again, it's like,
that's some incredible optimism.
yeah. Again, so, if somebody was like, yeah, you go kill Ahmaud Arbery this week, and then we're gonna go kill Breonna Taylor this week, and then we're gonna kill fucking George Floyd this week, and then black people are gonna riot. It's not that simple. In hindsight, it looks like it escalated like that,
but it didn't.
It was just a bunch of random chaotic events. So, and that's where, like, the government does not want a situation they can't control.
Yeah. I pulled up the Indiana numbers, and in Indiana, 44.3% of cases are white people, who represent 85% of the population. 13.1% are black or African American, who represent 9.8% of the population. And the rest is other, Asian, and unknown, which represent just over 5% of the population, and are around 40% of the total cases. But when we look at like Monroe County, for example, the number of cases is 76% white, 9.2% black or African American, 4.3% other, 1% Asian and 9.2% unknown. So I think that you're right. I think that in the long run, just because of the population distribution, you can't have more cases of black people with COVID if, what is it, 12 to 15% of the population? 12 to 15% of the population can't sustain all of the cases of COVID. It has to be distributed amongst the rest of the profiles.
Yeah, we would have started assuming equal distribution based on the races, but now that we know it's disproportionately affecting the black population, we know the proportion by which it's affecting black populations in different states. It's not like the national average is disproportionately affected, because then one of the things I noticed is like, even in areas where it's like 80% black, like Atlanta or something, it wouldn't be 80% black population getting the disease. So it's not, even like when the black population is the majority, it's not even necessarily affecting the black population at the percentage that you would anticipate based on even equal distribution. And that's where I've had to like look at the numbers and the distributions and try to come up with like there's more rational explanations and more irrational explanations. And the more rational explanations I can come up with is that the distribution of it has to do with socioeconomic status in tandem with access to healthcare. It's almost like those are the two most exclusive things that are going to determine one's capacity to identify if you have it, and then to treat it. Because again, it's like when Idris Elba was like getting tested and treated, well, he's obviously not one of the black people that are dying from it because he's not disproportionately affected by poor healthcare. So then that's when it comes down to the black people that are disproportionately affected are the ones that already had poor access to healthcare in the first place.
Yeah.
It's not the Idris Elbas and the Denzel Washingtons and the Will Smiths. Will Smith's not going to fucking die from COVID. You know what I'm saying? So
Magic Johnson didn't die from AIDS.
Right. Magic Johnson beat AIDS. Magic Johnson ain't going to fucking die from COVID because he's got the resources to beat that shit.
Yeah.
It's the people who don't have the resources, black, white, Asian, whatever race or like, it's the socioeconomic status as far as I can tell. And one of the other conspiracies out there is like, if it's engineered in a lab, there would be something that would prevent whatever group engineered it from getting it. That's not the case. Once a virus is out in the wild, that shit mutates too fast for something to be controllable. And it's like, even if you're immune to the original, whatever it mutates into isn't necessarily something that you're going to be immune to. So that's a terrible way for that. Like, if that supervillain existed, that'd be a stupid ass supervillain, and that supervillain would be susceptible to their own disease. So they're not immune to it. And even if there's a vaccine to one iteration, there's not going to be a vaccine to the mutated iteration. That's why there's already at least two different versions of COVID. There's the one that was traced to Europe and the one that was traced to China. So there's like at least already two strains that are out in the wild that are not the same, and with one vaccine for one would not work for the other necessarily.
Plus the 28 other strains that were identified by the Israelis. Science has been looking for a vaccine for the common cold since the 50s, and they haven't come up with one yet. And if that's an illustration for what's to come, we've got a really long road ahead of us, because the common cold is also a coronavirus. Apparently, there are a lot of coronavirus out there, and some of them some people have antibodies for, and they don't get sick very often, but they still occasionally get the common cold because the common cold's a motherfucker. And incidentally, the Chinese antibody treatment, it only generates antibodies for SARS-CoV-2 if you don't already have antibodies to the common cold. So that's not a one-size-fits-all solution either. We've got a really long road ahead of us.
Speaking of a long road, I think of developing therapies. I think of the vaccines that are in development, the therapies that are in development. These all need to go through clinical trials. Some of them are already in clinical trials. Phase 1 clinical trials establish safety in a healthy population. Phase 2 is safety and efficacy, and phase 3 is a continuation of efficacy and tracks adverse events. And normally in the life cycle of a drug or a biologic, like a vaccine, can take anywhere from 5 to 7 years for that cycle to complete. And if it's for a rare disease or a rare drug, it can take a little bit shorter depending on what kind of designation you receive from the health authority. So in this case, it would be
today, Cambridge-based Moderna announced plans for phase 3 trials of their COVID-19 vaccine.
Right. So Moderna is on a highly accelerated timeline. It's one of the most accelerated timelines I think that a modern pharmaceutical company or drug company has probably seen or experienced. Moderna is a mRNA platform-based drug company.
For those that are wondering, Daniel works in the pharmaceutical industry performing quality assurance. So this is one of the areas where his insight is actually pretty incredible. Please continue. I didn't mean to cut you off. I just want to make sure that
I think context is always important. In quality assurance, we always look at context as well. And in terms of drug development, we want to look at context. But if you think about the average life cycle of a drug from discovery to market, take 8 to 10 years and upwards of $3 billion.
And we never saw a real functional vaccine for SARS-1 or MERS even.
Right.
And even then, those vaccines only provided a couple of years worth of antibodies, it seems.
Well, if you think about even the influenza vaccine, we have entire pharmaceutical or drug companies that have dedicated units for vaccine development and vaccine manufacture. And there are companies that are dedicated specifically to the manufacture of vaccines. So aseptic fill and finish. Aseptic is the type of manufacturing where you have very specific levels of control to ensure that there's no contamination. So you have aseptic fill finish, you have compositing, you have to have an area where you culture the components of the vaccine, so the virus or the toxin. So for tetanus and diphtheria vaccine, you culture both of those. It takes time. And if you think about what we have vaccines for currently, and if you think of influenza, you have to get a vaccine every year, and it could be for a different strain. There could be new strains, there could be evolved strains. And companies have to stay on top of that in advance and then set their manufacturing timelines in advance. And that takes a lot of coordination, and that takes millions and millions of dollars. That takes a lot of investment of time and resources and planning, as well as materials in order to accomplish that. So when we think of what's required in order to develop first, so discover, develop, test, manufacture. So you have to put the vaccine through. So if we're just talking about a vaccine, you have to put the vaccine through preclinical testing for safety as well, and that preclinical means in animals. And then you put it into first in human trials in phase 1. And Moderna was on a highly accelerated timeline and received additional funding from DARPA in order to accomplish these goals. But for all these other companies that have partnerships with big pharma companies like J&J or Sanofi or so Moderna and DARPA and other companies, just the timelines are so highly accelerated, and the resources that are being funneled towards these efforts are immense. But we have to make sure that our expectations are realistic. Otherwise, we may find ourselves in a situation where our sample population wasn't big enough or longitudinal enough. And I'm sure these are things that are being considered by the experts and residents within these companies. I can't be the only person to think about this, but it's important to note that side effects exist for just about every drug product, from Tylenol all the way up to cancer medication. And there are longitudinal studies with thousands of patients for various medications that have already been developed that establish a safety profile as well as efficacy. So a drug can be efficacious in eliminating or eradicating cancer cells, but it can also be toxic to a person. And that's where you get things like boxed warnings from FDA indicating that serious adverse events can occur. And anytime during a clinical trial when a serious adverse event occurs, and that's a serious adverse event means somebody ends up in the hospital or unfortunately could end up passing away or is in a life-threatening situation due to an interaction with the drug or with the test article. So the point is we want to make sure that our sample sizes are large enough to establish safety within a large population, so that we can confidently administer these vaccines and expect the least amount of side effects, because oftentimes with established vaccines, there are safety profiles for these vaccines or formulations have changed in order to make them safer over time. And we just want to ensure that there isn't an unforeseen consequence of rushing the development of treatments or vaccines, because any drug, biologic, or medical device, when not developed properly or when quality principles are not adhered to during its development or during its manufacture, will affect its safety, identity, strength, and purity. And any drug company and any person working at a drug company should have the safety of the patient at the forefront of their minds when they're conducting their activities.
So on that note, I'm going to ask this question, and obviously it's hypothetical, but I want you to be as honest as you possibly can. Will you be taking the first round of vaccines?
I have to learn more about it first. That's as honest as I can be.
Thank you for being honest, because again, that's where it's like, that's how I feel. In that, like, everything you're saying, everything you just said is the stance of someone who's approaching this from a rational perspective. At the same time, when you have the prospect of potentially dying and then you have a potential vaccine, it becomes this weird, like, catch-22 where you're like, I don't know if I want to be, like, if this is the time to be the early adopter or not. And that's where,
yeah, absolutely. And when we talk about
in tandem with the accelerated trials,
right. And I think what we might end up seeing are healthcare professionals getting in-depth educations and becoming key opinion leaders and becoming subject matter experts within a particular state to advise local governments or state governments, and this is me hypothesizing, on how to adopt vaccination of the public. You're going to have people who know a lot about the safety profile, a lot about the risks, and will make a determination as to whether or not they think its distribution within a particular state based off of its level of the rate of infection or the rate of mortality makes sense. I know people are waiting for a treatment. I'm waiting for a treatment. I'm waiting for a vaccine as well. I know I would talk to my doctor about it. Again, that's where I would have to learn as much as possible. But in regards to all the medications that I may be taking or not taking, or that I may be involved in the manufacture of professionally, I try to learn as much as possible about those as well. You know, I always read the side effects. I look at clinical trials. You can go on clinicaltrials.gov and see perhaps whether the active clinical trials for the Moderna vaccine are currently in place, and read the data from these clinical trials and interpret the data. But I think ultimately we're going to have to see an evolution or a development of serious methods of disseminating accurate information. And we're going to also have to look to our thought leaders within the healthcare organizations and the healthcare guidance organizations, so the CDC, as well as from hopefully the more rational aspects of executive advisory, making the right kind of recommendations.
Oh, but our politicians, they know better because they're tapped into some kind of weird, they can just feel this stuff. I remember like a month ago, the mayor of Las Vegas was offering up the city itself as the control group. Like, just let them get infected. We'll just give them a placebo.
Oh, right. The mayor of Las Vegas. I remember that interview. That was really strange. Yeah, that was really strange. And to make that determination on behalf of
an entire city,
people who have free will, and that, I think that's kind of irresponsible. Also, if there's at the time of that particular interview, there was no really viable treatment.
Yeah.
So to say let's just all get infected, that's the same as saying let's all go to a chickenpox lollipop party and infect our kids. It's highly irresponsible.
Which is a thing, though. You know, that's where those people existed, man. Like, that's a whole segment of America. Yeah, they for sure. And that's like, those people are ones we have to coexist with.
Yes, and those are people, who engage in, who don't. I think it's the confirmation bias we were talking about.
Yep.
Yes, for sure.
They use the internet as a tool predominantly to confirm their biases. When they talk about the toxins in vaccines, they talk about, there's mercury in a vaccine. Well, there's something called thimerosal in a vaccine. It's related to mercury, and it's in a very minuscule amount, and it's used as what's called an adjuvant in order to stimulate an immune response so that the vaccine actually works better. It's part of the vaccine. It's an ingredient. It's there for your health. It's not there to hurt you. So, people basically ignoring that aspect, which is easily retrievable from any reliable source, hopefully reliable source.
Oh, but it contains mercury.
Right? It's not like they're breaking open thermometers and dropping them into vats, and it's an uncontrolled evil environment trying to poison people. It's the exact opposite.
Yeah.
And that's oftentimes what these vaccines are made out to be, instead of really taking a look at all of the work that's put into establishing a safety profile and ensuring that people do not get poisoned when they take them. Not to say that there aren't side effects for anything. Side effects for just about any medication. That's why there has to be labeling. That's why there was the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. That's why the FDA was created. That's why there were, that's the entire history of federal regulations of food, drugs, and cosmetics in the United States. It's so that there can be, so that essentially you're not ingesting snake oil like they used to. Like, tonics were being sold, and you could say whatever you wanted to about them. You could say that, codeine mixed with, ethylene glycol will cure your bronchitis, right? To make unfounded claims. And unfortunately, we have people making irresponsible, unfounded claims about things that have very responsibly researched and founded claims about.
Ethylene glycol.
So I think that's a good segue. You work in pharmaceuticals. So, where do you think the responsibility lies concerning um, deciding where the line is, where health can be profited upon, and where health can be like right? Like, where, at what point does a person's health become a national security risk if they don't have it preserved, and at what point is it okay to start profiting off that person's health? Like, because
I wish that the entire healthcare system in the United States allowed for everybody who requires healthcare to have it. I think it's unfortunate that people are pushed into situations where they have to choose between food, rent, and healthcare. That being said, you're absolutely correct. It's the capitalist structure.
Well, because I get that we need, and like, there has to be money to go into drug research, because for every successful drug that comes to the shelf or comes to market, there may have been 10,000, a million failures that didn't work. So
yes.
I get that part. So
yes.
That's where, do you have any viable paths to getting, like, how do you see a path to getting people drugs that have been well researched without them having to pay exorbitant amounts?
Okay, that's a very valid question, and there are actually a couple of companies that have started moving in that direction already. One of them is called Civica RX, and then the other one's called EQRX. And the goals of both companies is actually to get either generic or branded drugs to patients at much lower cost to the patient. I'm not intimately familiar with their models, but I know that is their mission. That is their statement.
Yeah, that's good to hear. At least there's a couple organizations working on it, because I know, isn't there like a 40-year restriction on drugs once they get patented or something, or is it 73?
7.
Oh, it's 7. Okay. So
and then you can get an extension if you have a certain designation by FDA.
Got it. Okay. So okay.
Right. That's why pharmaceutical companies or drug companies, especially the smaller ones, and even the larger ones to a certain extent, why they're always under pressure to develop new things in their pipeline or to have a robust pipeline. That's why you see these days so many acquisitions. Like, for instance, there was you'll see one within the past 3 years or so. I think there have been 2 tens of billions of dollars mergers. So like there was one merger or one acquisition that was over $62 billion. And it was one company acquiring another. And essentially, not only did it acquire its infrastructure, it acquired all of its portfolio. And It acquired everything that it was in development in its pipeline.
That's not a merger. That's just buying them out.
Well, they're in the process of integration right now.
Sure, call it integration, but if one company absorbs another company, that's not a merger. I mean,
we hear these words thrown around very often, but
euphemisms.
We know euphemisms.
It occurred to me that our First Amendment might not necessarily actually protect our freedom of speech. It's more that it defines what freedom of speech is. And on that note, we're going to take another break. Hey, we're back. So before we took our break, Daniel was talking about the complexities and intricacies of the pharmaceutical industry, and I want to get right back into this because I think this is a fascinating subject. And go ahead, Daniel.
Thanks. No, great questions were asked, and I'm glad that these questions are asked because as we did briefly discuss a few moments ago, it brings into focus the relative opacity that people experience perceptually when they perceive or when they look at the pharmaceutical industry or the biotechnology industry. And the biopharma industry is a highly multifaceted, dynamic, at times volatile, and then also at times opaque. Some companies are opaque, and some companies, do have a history of actions that, in retrospect, have been shown to be not necessarily in line with, ethical practices. And then there are consequences. And then there are other companies, many companies, that are actually very fantastic in how they engage their patient populations, how passionate the people who work there are about getting medications or medicines, whatever the modality is. If it's an injectable, it's called a parenteral, or if it's an oral solid dose. And there's so many steps that go into getting a drug into the patient's hands. And it's not all about getting it to market. Because if you think about a rare disease, so for instance, there could be a rare form of cancer, just as an example to focus the scope, and perhaps only 2,000 people in the United States suffer from it, but it can be cured, or it can be attenuated, or the life expectancy can be increased by taking this product. And a special designation can be given to the development process or to the regulatory pathway of this product that allows for compassionate use under emergency situations. It can be, so if somebody is seriously ill and they're not able to get the drug, or there's an issue with their insurance, there are methods that a lot of companies often employ in order to ensure that the drug can actually make it to the patient. There are some companies that are a little more developed that have entire departments dedicated towards patient accessibility and patient access. So again, when we talk about the limitations of the healthcare structure within, we'll just focus on the United States and the privatization of health insurance and the difficulty that arises from that in terms of how a person can get access to health insurance or get access to the healthcare they need or get access to the medications that they need without ending up bankrupt. These companies aren't just looking to make a buck. Of course, they're trying to sustain themselves as businesses because their business is to get medications to people.
Labs aren't cheap.
Say what?
Labs aren't cheap. Lab equipment's not cheap at all.
Right. So a smaller company can do a Series A or Series B financing of, say, $120 million, and almost half of that could go to R&D and give them runway for another year or two. And that's a relatively small company. And it also depends on how many trials they have going. It depends on how much R&D they have going at any given time. But again, it goes back to the companies are aware, and I think it's become an increasing focus, especially with the establishment of the companies that we discussed before, the ones that are focused on getting more the same quality of medication at a more inexpensive rate to the people who need them. These companies, of all sizes, they're aware of the imperfections of the insurance system in the United States. And they're looking for ways to make it work for the people who need their products, especially people who may end up being in clinical trials. If somebody's on a clinical trial, then they'll get, hopefully, depending on the type of clinical trial design there is. If there's a placebo control, somebody may not receive the product, but if they do receive the product, if it's blind, double blind, if they do receive the product, then they're going to be getting treated. And if a certain level of efficacy has been shown in preclinical studies, and this is a phase 1 for a rare disease, or a phase 2A for a rare disease, that's like a first step of a phase 2 clinical trial, then there can be hope for the people who are suffering from the rare diseases.
Yeah, that's a great point that I think a lot of people don't necessarily know about as like a use case generally. So with that said, like, I guess, is there enough transparency to the point where if I asked you, like, what the average pharmaceutical company profits off of it, like, what's their average profit margin, would that be easily accessible, or is that something where they only put out?
They release their financials on a quarterly basis, and usually all products are covered in those financials, for better or for worse.
Because they have like shareholders that they have to report to, so there is some sort of
exactly. They all have investments. Yeah, they have investors, they have underwriters, all of that.
So it would be really difficult actually for conflict of interest to arise because of the transparency processes. Like, because I guess what I'm getting at is, like, if I have Pfizer invested in Lilly, and then they have something that they torpedo their own like, what's it called? Their own trial, because Lilly's trial is coming out, and then somebody on the board offloads a bunch of stock. It would be more difficult to pull off than people think, is what I'm getting at, because they have to have some level of transparency as an organization. Like, maybe as an individual, well, because even then they have to report. Like, if you're like an executive or a board holder, don't you have to report when you sell stock?
You do. And actually there was an interesting, so Moderna's stock went up, and
they sold like 30 million.
Right. But that was an automatic.
Yep. Because they had it in
it was in their contract, essentially, that these stock awards that they're receiving as executives, once the stock reaches a certain level, if the stock reaches a certain level, it's essentially compensating them for the risk of working at the company, given all of their years of experience and the time that they're going to put into developing a successful product. So, and that puts them into the position to make that kind of money. But every time an executive or an insider makes a stock purchase or a stock sale, it needs to be reported to the SEC, and those filings are publicly available.
Yeah, because again, I think once people start to understand the actual, Sarbanes-Oxley in tandem with like the other shit that occurs with reporting requirements for private organizations, it's actually a lot more difficult to pull off conspiracies without going to jail.
People get caught.
Yeah, and they get fined a lot. It depends on the conspiracy, but they might get fined, but they also might go to jail. That's where I think some people might forget when Martha Stewart went to jail for insider trading. But that's just a known example. Again, some people just may not even know about it. But yeah, it's not as easy to pull off like massive conspiracies, because I think a lot of people might consider the notion of like, even if coronavirus wasn't created in a lab, if there's some sort of conspiracy for the companies making the vaccines to make a shitload of money, well, it's like, yeah, if somebody comes up with a successful vaccine, they're probably going to profit, but the notion of like a coordinated effort of organizations working to make this stuff happen behind the scenes in a way that then they can just offload, like, oh yeah, we've had 1,000 recoveries this week, and then offload a bunch of stock without getting caught. You can't really do that.
You cannot do that. No, that today, with today's regulations and today's reporting practices, and I think going back even a couple of decades, you can't do that.
Yeah, because it sounds super easy, but understanding the regulations that are in place, it would be very, very difficult for someone to actually pull off something like that and not go to jail. Because we're talking about, like if Daniel's a worker in an organization, if he's not making money off of a transaction like that, he's not going to want to be associated with that. So unless people, like, if there's a conspiracy, if people aren't getting compensated for it, it's not in their best interest for that conspiracy to keep going. And that's why we have whistleblower protection laws. And that's kind of where, again, it's like, we've gotten to a point full circle where we need to start diffusing conspiracies to reduce them to capacity. A conspiracy can only be as complex as the capacity to execute, period.
Yeah.
Like, you can't
Absolutely.
have a conspiracy that goes beyond your capacity. And if a person's capacity to trade is so heavily regulated that they can't pull off these conspiracies on their own, if there is no COVID, it's not going to be easier to pull off conspiracies under coronavirus pandemic times when people are under even more scrutiny. So,
especially in the post Purdue Pharma U.S. opium wars world, where those bastards got fined. They didn't get, they probably should have been fined more. Some of them probably should be spending time in prison. But I guess that's what we got. We got some. They fined them. And what about that guy that bought the Martin shitface dude? The dude who raised the
Martin
price.
Shkreli?
Yeah, that piece of punk ass bullshit.
Wasn't Martin Shkreli involved in securities fraud?
I think so, but he also did some other things like raise the price of insulin.
Oh, right.
Or something like.
It wasn't insulin. It was a anti-parasitic that I think is used to treat a rare disease. Was it?
I remember it was something like it was something absurd. Like he raised the price of the drug like 700% or something dumb, and then he went and bought like.
Might have been like 3,000%.
Oh yeah, it was something obscene. It was so obscene that everyone freaked out, and then he went and took the money and then way overbid for the one and only copy of a Wu-Tang album, and then said something about how he doesn't even listen to Wu-Tang, he just wanted to have it. And then they put him in prison, and so he's in prison, and coronavirus happens, and he says, "If you let me out, I'll develop a vaccine for you." I'm pretty sure this guy he's not even a scientist. He's a Wall Street hack who got caught cheating. This is the kind of bullshit that we've got to dismantle. These are the this is what generates the conspiracy is people that are working beyond their scope and diving into really deep waters, and they can do it sufficiently to a point where they fuck things up, and then it hurts people.
Well, to your point, diving into deep water or trying to protect people from any negative effects of the drugs that they're taking, not only and as Lindsay mentions in the comments, not only are doctors required to... I beg your pardon?
It was EpiPens. She pointed out that it was the EpiPen.
I think that was Mylan who did that.
Or not the EpiPen, something else.
Yeah, those got raised too, but by a different company. Where was I going with that? Right. So not only are doctors required to sign financial disclosures according to federal regulations, if they do anything remotely unethical while conducting a clinical trial, and that's down to starting someone on a dose before formally enrolling them in a clinical trial, or not properly consenting somebody before starting a clinical trial, And that's identified because clinical trials are monitored, or at least they should be.
In America.
In America, right? And even in the EU, the EMA, the European Medicines Authority, has very stringent regulations regarding drug development and oversight and health oversight. And so does the UK, and so does Ireland.
So for years I've joked about the Chinese Space Agency. Basically, they're just doing it. They've got such a huge sample of potential astronauts that they're just going to try everything until they get something that works. And I hope that that's not the case in China. But do you know about China's pharmaceutical industry? Do they have that same kind of regulation within trials? Are you aware?
So this is publicly available. So what I will say is this: if you go to FDA's website and you look at warning letters from regulatory inspections of various organizations, you will see several from Chinese companies. And warning letters are usually sent if observations from a regulatory inspection aren't properly addressed. So the first thing you have is an inspection, and the inspection could be for cause or it could be routine. And then following that, if the responses to the notice or the observations that are shared by the inspector or by the office of the federal regulator aren't addressed properly, then you get a warning letter, and you can get severely fined. As an organization, you can get fined. You can essentially have your capacity to manufacture shut off or delayed, or you could end up under something called what's called a consent decree, which essentially means that a third-party organization needs to sign off on everything you do from a quality standpoint or a regulatory oversight standpoint prior to moving forward with any of your operations. And there are several Chinese organizations that do have warning letters that are available on the FDA website.
Yeah, that's good to hear. In that, I've seen a lot of Chinese publications in my line of research, but I didn't know if that was happening in pharmaceuticals as well. But if there's like there must be like an international barrier for those trials where it's like, if it didn't pass FDA approval, it's not getting the same labeling because it's got some other country or is there another country that FDA will the EU will the FDA accept EU vetted pharmaceuticals, do their trials?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Does the EU is there any country or federation which the FDA says their standards are good by us?
Oh yeah, the FDA and the EMA, which regulates, which is the health authority for the EU, work very closely together in sharing policy and establishing standards, because a lot of clinical trials for U.S. companies occur in Europe, and it's entirely possible that global trials that are being conducted by European firms can occur in the U.S. as well, because everybody wants to market their products globally if possible, and in as many locations as makes sense for the patient population. Also, the MHRA, which is in the UK, the US FDA works closely with them, the EMA works closely with them. And then the Irish Health Authority, whose name escapes me at the moment, and it shouldn't, its name escapes me at the moment. That is an organization that the United States FDA also takes a lot of notes from. And then also Health Canada, which is the Canadian Health Authority. And then in Japan, you have PMDA, which is the health authority for Japan and regulates clinical trials and drug manufacturing.
The Irish Medicines Board, the Health Products Regulatory Authority.
There you go.
God, what a long name.
Yep. And the Irish are known to be, they have very high standards for quality. And oftentimes you'll see consultants from Ireland advising firms from across the world.
Well, that's good. That's actually really refreshing, because oftentimes the stereotypes that are associated with Irish culture are, not desirable. But that's really just in America, I think. I don't think
there are a lot of great things about Ireland.
No, I know, but in this country, Ireland, the Irish people were castigated for a considerable period of time, and there are still, jokes run rampant about Irish culture to this day. So, and they're not really funny either. But it's nice to hear that they take their medicine very seriously. It's actually, it's really nice to hear that any culture takes the development of medicine very seriously, because I hate to think of what it must be like to be in a country where they're just like, here, kid, take this.
No, it's certainly not like that, but I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
Actually, I believe it was Japan, Canada, the US, and the EU worked together as part of the International Conference on Harmonization, known as the ICH. And they established quality, safety, and regulatory practices that apply to global firms to basically give a framework as to how to approach drug development and research from a global standpoint. And that way you had the opinions of the key opinions of the foremost health authorities working together to provide guidance to companies trying to ensure that their products met safety, identity, strength, purity, and quality standards for their patients.
Oh, that's good. So there is hope that we can rise from the ashes here.
Oh, absolutely.
There's a broad future that we can expect to emerge from all of this turmoil. I think that it's important that we remember that presidential administrations aren't forever, and whatever power play that the media is trying to represent as, he's never going to leave office, or all of these things, they make money off of clicks and page refreshes. And so, if there was ever a time that we had to really scrutinize our information sources, it's right now, more than ever. Especially because, so the other day I saw this. It was talking about Joe Biden and why the black community seems to be in such strong support for him, and the argument that was presented in this series of tweets was that the black community is pragmatic and that they don't trust white people who fully support Bernie Sanders to make the right decision anyways. And so the idea is that they would support Biden. And then, of course, the media comes back full force with, the crime bill that Clinton signed, and that a lot of the problems that black communities are facing today are the result of legislation that good old JoJo put into effect. And it's really tough. I don't really like him. I don't like the Green Party candidate. I can't remember her name. I don't like Trump. I don't like any of these people. Anytime I read anything about him, it just makes me feel like, this again. But it's actually
exhausting.
Yeah, it really is. I just feel like
absolutely exhausting.
I just feel like at some point we're not even fighting for America anymore. We're just we're fighting for who's going to ruin this place the slowest. And I almost feel like if we'd have had like Ross Perot or someone like some idiot like that sooner, things would have devolved faster. If we'd have had McCain, shit might have been.
Well, have you
stable.
looked at Ross Perot's platforms lately?
You know, Ross Perot's platform looks really fucking reasonable right now.
It's really good.
I mean,
it was really good.
yeah,
it was
that's-
like really good.
Yeah, no, that's the thing.
He
It's like,
just got he got ridiculed by SNL,
yeah,
and from like everybody has this idea that he's an idiot in their heads because of SNL, which is insane. Because I went back and looked at his platforms based on. I was like, man, I wonder
what would
if
have happened?
SNL just ruined him. And sure enough, his platforms were so like forward that his shit is like, if he ran on that now,
He'd win.
it sound like he was a progressive candidate.
Yeah. No, seriously.
Like most of the shit that he ran on.
There are so many things about politics in America that just leave me like mouth open, bug-eyed. Like, how the fuck? At this point, I feel like everything should be dissolving or eroding or collapsing or just, you know, the keystones are missing. How is this thing still standing?
He wanted to implement electronic town halls to enable and empower direct democracy. This was in fucking 92.
God. Oh, man.
There was no COVID-19 for him to be suggesting electronic town halls.
Yeah. Well, he was actually like a legit billionaire, right? He's one of the success stories of the American dream, right? Something like that.
Yeah, he was like what was it
An oil tycoon or something.
it was either oil or natural gas.
Some petrochemical thing. Yes, why do they all have to be white men in their 70s? It's because even when we get a young candidate, our media just smears the crap out of them. Or we get Pete Buttigieg, who no one wants to trust after he gets some pocket change from big institutions, even though I'm pretty sure Joe Biden's got some big institutional backing. And I'm pretty sure that they've all got institutional backing. We're voting for parties who are
shit.
part of the institution.
No, Perot Systems is how he made his money. Apparently, they got acquired by Dell.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so he was a information technology guy, like altogether. And for whatever reason, yeah, he just got lumped in. Oh, I think T. Boone Pickens is who it, like him and T. Boone Pickens get conflated because they're just like old white dudes that are rich, is what it comes down to. Because T. Boone Pickens is the natural gas guy who also started buying up aquifers and shit.
Oh my God. So we had an actual IT guy who got really fucking close, and holy shit. I'm looking at his information right now. I'm actually kind of like bethrottled by this. I'm not quite sure how. Wait, what does it say? The merger to Dell failed. Continued conflicts in the culture, loss of talent, various clients such as tenant hospitals. So people jumped ship because they didn't want to work with Dell.
I mean, it's hard to like. I mean, he sold them to Dell, but I think that was like yeah, that's way later, it seems like. But regardless, he had I guess he was pro drug war, but everything else was fairly forward thinking for the most part. So it's just crazy to see this guy as like a potential presidential candidate of the past compared to the bullshit we have. I mean, he's not the greatest guy, but compared to the bullshit we have now, he's like a fucking super genius. It's crazy.
Seriously, I think at this point, if we went back in time and got that guy elected, I'm pretty sure the world would be pretty similar to it how it is now, though.
I doubt it, honestly. I think we'd be way more technologically advanced, if anything.
Well, yeah.
Just because what ultimately happens is the social impacts, like, get rolled back.
This dude made an Eagle Scout in 13 months. I take it all back.
He used to work at IBM.
Dude,
you know what I'm saying?
No, what I'm getting is that he made it through an Eagle Scout, made it through all the merit badges, and acquired an Eagle Scout within 13 months. That's like that's not normal. That's like super hardcore.
Yeah. This dude was something that, to have him reduced to a Dana Carvey skit is like
very disingenuous.
It's a travesty, man. It's a travesty that dude got reduced to a memory that wasn't even his, and had the capacity. Like, I sincerely believe that if he become president, because I doubt he would have been like a warmonger. He just doesn't seem. I mean, he didn't seem like that type of dude.
Yeah.
And just the fact that he had such a technology-focused campaign in like '92. I mean, coming out of the year 2000, if the internet had become a much like, okay, just imagine if the United States Post Office had an internet segment where they had servers in every office. By the year 2000, everybody had a public email address. There probably would have been a public social network that was protected by the First Amendment. He probably would have beat Facebook to the punch. There's all this other shit that could have happened because he was so technologically advanced and inclined that in the position of a president, like, we haven't had anybody even remotely that close.
No, you're right.
That technologically inclined in that position of authority.
So what kind of con job did the media pull on us to get us to reject this guy?
That's the crazy shit when you get older, to look back. That's why I fucking, the Alec Baldwin shit of him playing Donald Trump did more harm than good, because it reduced Donald Trump into a joke. But like, nobody believed he could win the campaign because he got turned into a joke. That was the last thing they fucking needed. That's where, if we're talking about, it's not a conspiracy, it's poor strategy.
Yeah.
We need to look at all these things that people look at as innocuous that have been terrible strategy. Let's not turn politics into jokes, because that's all people remember.
Well,
when people think of when like left-wing people thought of Donald Trump, they thought of Alec Baldwin, because that's what dominated their psyche for like 6 months. And then they couldn't understand how they fucking lost the election, because they got so out of touch with reality that they had thought of Alec Baldwin as actually Donald Trump.
I think that you're absolutely right. I think that we're at this really critical juncture where part of the reason people don't take politics seriously is that it's been rendered into a joke for the most part, for the masses who aren't going to pay enough attention, or who aren't willing to read, who aren't going to reflect upon the history. And it's that's landed us right where we are now, and we've got to make some tough decisions. I don't feel like I can trust people who go for the straight party line, and I see them all the time in threads all over the place. It's just, man, all I feel is, where did you read that? Where did you hear that? Who said that? And of course, you never get an answer as to where this information comes from. It just comes from the void of the internet.
And that's exactly what we were talking about earlier with people using the internet as a tool to confirm their own perceptions and their own preconceived ideas.
Yeah.
And then tying it into how the media, how popular culture exercises its ability to influence people in order to essentially create those biases.
Yeah, and I think it's difficult to navigate in this landscape, but it's not impossible. People have to learn to trust themselves and not look at information authorities as unquestionable. Like, I want people to question what I say and go confirm it and look it up. and like be like, oh yeah, there's a bunch of stuff about all these things that he's saying that are true, or this one thing he said was a misstatement. You know, I make misstatements all the time because I'm fucking getting old. So, you know, that shit happens. The older we get, the more we have to look at stuff to make sure the information matches what we remember, like what we remember matches what was originally posted or written. I don't know about you guys, but my memory is like
My memory's not what it used
terrible. To be. Yeah, it's definitely not what it used to be, though.
I think what's important to consider is the term that I've come to hold near and dear to my heart is adult onset illiteracy. And when people get so far removed from the primary sources of their youth, the primary sources of their college years, the times when they've been forced to really dig into the books, to go into the stacks and pull up the photos from the time that they're researching. And then by the time they reach a certain age, when they have their kids or they have their jobs and society has pounded them into a position where they can no longer spend as much of their attention span trying to verify the veracity of and the validity and the truth of the information that they're consuming. We find ourselves with a large population of people who just want to be told what to think. And that's when we have situations like we've been discussing for the past several minutes, where you have a large population of people being influenced by illusions, essentially.
Exceptional Randos Show is produced live in Sunroom Studios' Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you'd like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening.